the topic of equity, diversity, and inclusion in research as part of our 2021 ORIS EDI workshop series. At the University of Windsor and ORIS, we recognize that successfully incorporating EDI into your research and your design and your research practices are fundamental steps in achieving continued research excellence. It's my sincere hope that by attending today's session that you'll be gaining skills to create strong EDI statements which will aid you in successfully securing grant applications and project funding, and it can also provide a blueprint for incorporating and benefiting from EDI within your lab. So I'd like to, next slide. So I want to start the day with a land acknowledgement, and recognizing that many of us are still working remotely and virtually, I want to also recognize that the land acknowledgement that we're giving today is representative of where I am located in Windsor, Essex County. And given that we have attendees from a range of locations, I'd like to ask that you respectively acknowledge the land that you're currently located on. The University of Windsor sits on the traditional territories of the Three Fires Confederacy of the First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. We respect the long-standing relationships with our First Nations peoples in this place, the 100-mile Windsor-Essex Peninsula and the Straits of Detroit, Miigwech. So next slide. So today's session, we are welcoming back Dr. Lisa Willis from the University of Alberta, who will be discussing today writing effective EDI statements and providing meaningful insights into how your research can successfully include equity, diversity, and inclusion principles and practices, and how that can support your research grant applications as well. Lisa has given many similar sessions across Canada, including the University of Windsor last year, to many academic audiences who have benefited from her ability to explain EDI in the context of research and the grant writing process. Today, Lisa will guide you through applying EDI literature into your grant applications and will cover topics including the rationale for working with diverse scientific teams, the current numbers for diversity in Canadian STEM, and the controlled studies demonstrating bias in STEM in your application. Lisa will also discuss mechanisms for integrating good EDI principles within your daily lab environment and will provide us with some insight into how you can incorporate this information into effective EDI statements for your grant applications. So also in support of EDI at the University of Windsor, Lisa has enabled the creation of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Student Awards following her webinar last summer to support the grassroots EDI work that's being done here at the University of Windsor by our students. So last year, in lieu of a speaking fee, Lisa requested that we establish these student awards, and we will be continuing that again this year. Last year, we had 2 student awards that were awarded to 2 amazing students, Aislinn Lewis Laurent and Erica Rossi. Both, I mean, we were blown away with the applications that we received for last year's competition, and we'll be continuing that this year as well. So Aislinn is from the Faculty of Science, Chemistry and Biochemistry, and Computer Science, and Erica is in the Faculty of Engineering. Both have been doing some outstanding work to support EDI in a wide range of areas, and again, just was really inspired by some of the great work that many of the nominees had outlined that they were undertaking. So please look for details in your inbox in the coming days relating to this year's Student EDI Awards, and be sure to nominate any student researchers that you think might be deserving of the recognition for their EDI leadership. So finally, before getting started, just a few housekeeping points. So today's session is being recorded, and we will be making that available on the ORIS website shortly under our EDI tab, where you will find additional EDI resources. We've also posted other sessions in our 2021 workshop series and some of last year's sessions as well. So some great resources there as well for you. Secondly, if you have any questions during the presentation, you can ask them within the chat feature located at the bottom of the presentation screen or by using the raise hand feature. There'll also be a designated Q&A component of the presentation at the end of the presentation, and Michelle and Maggie Glore from ORIS will be moderating and monitoring those Q&As as well. Given the presentation is being recorded, if you do have a question that you would like to ask anonymously, you can send that to a direct chat to our moderator, Michelle Nevitt, who can ask that question to Lisa on your behalf as well. So I'd also like to thank both Michelle and Maggie, today's session organizers, for doing a great job again in organizing the session. We hope that you find this session and our workshop series to be helpful for you in creating a diverse and inclusive environment in your research labs and with your research teams. Finally, we'll be sending out a survey following today's event, and we would really appreciate you completing that survey and providing us with any feedback to help you to help us serve you better in the future. And with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Lisa Willis to begin her presentation. Thank you, Lisa, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. Hello, everyone. So I will share my screen. Can everyone see that beautiful picture of Jasper? Is that a yes? I'm not hearing anything. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah,
we got lots of thumbs up.
Perfect. Yep. Okay, excellent. So thank you very much for the introduction. I would like to also give a land acknowledgement because I am far away and because I think it's important. As many of you know, Canada is undergoing this painful but necessary process of reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples who have inhabited this land for many thousands of years. As someone who lives in Canada, not necessarily, doesn't have to be a Canadian citizen, but as someone who lives in Canada, it is really important for us to understand the issues and to participate to the best of our ability in the reconciliation process. That's something I feel very strongly. And it is also important to recognize our connection to the land, and for me to make a commitment to preserving the land for future generations, which is something that's also very important to many Indigenous peoples. So today we're talking about writing effective EDI statements for grant applications. And I'm happy to share my slides after the presentation, so you don't have to rapidly take pictures of the slides. I also have a really useful resource that we just published in ACS Central Science, this article that goes more in depth into EDI and what we can do about EDI. So there's lots of ideas in here that you could pull for your EDI statements, and this is freely available. It's not behind a paywall, so you can access that. And I just want to get started with what I hope is the most boring part of the talk, and it's just making sure we're all on the same page with regards to proper language in Canada. I will say that talking about EDI can be really challenging, especially if you're new to the area. And so while I'm putting proper language up here, because it's important for you to know, because it's important for you to use the proper language in your grant applications, in asking questions today, as long as you are willing to learn, the question is asked from a genuine place of trying to understand better. I am not offended by language or by content. This is an opportunity to ask the questions that you've been wanting to ask. And so I encourage you to do that. And while we're recording the bulk of this, at the very end, when we get to the question section, we will stop recording. So if there are questions that you want to actually ask, don't want to type in, but don't want to be recorded, you can wait until the end, and there's an opportunity there. So EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, are different things. Equity is providing people what they need to succeed, and creating a system where all people can succeed. And I always use the example of running a race and to illustrate the difference between equity and equality. Equality is treating everyone the same. That's not recognizing that people are different and need different things in order to succeed. And so if you think about running this race, equality is giving everyone the same size shoe, regardless of how big their foot is. And Obviously, I mean, intuitively, we know that that is not fair. That's not right. What we want is for everyone to have the size shoe that they need so that they can run their best race. We want people running their best race. We want to create an environment where they can do so. That's what equity is. Diversity is recognizing and valuing people's differences. And there's a large umbrella of differences. I have the definition from the Canadian government. It's everything that you would think would go in there: ethnicity, race, sexuality, etc. And then inclusion is making sure everyone has the opportunity to participate fully. It's not necessarily making sure everyone participates, but making sure we've created an environment where everybody can participate in a way that is comfortable for them. It's about being able to bring your full self to the table. That's inclusion. And then racialization or racialized person. These are updated terms from visible minority or person of color. So racialization is a verb. It's a process by which societies and individuals as members of societies construct races as real, different, and unequal in ways that matter. And then we have sex and gender. They are different but related, and they exist on a spectrum. So for sex, we refer to male and female, and for gender, we refer to masculinity and femininity. Sex is biological, hormones, chromosomes, that kind of thing, and gender is social. It's who you see yourself to be in the context of society, the expectations that society has for you, etc. They're related. Sex definitely influences gender. Gender also influences sex. Your lived experiences affect your biology, affects your hormones, it affects your cortisol, stress. We know that stress has biological effects on our bodies. So they are related, but they are different. That diagram was right from the CIHR website. So again, for proper language in Canada, we have 4 designated groups, also known as marginalized groups. We're trying to get away from the term underrepresented because you can experience discrimination and be marginalized, but actually be numerically the majority. And I'll give you an example of that. If we look at universities, so first-year university, certainly where I am, in biology has 50-60% female. And lots of racialization. But if you look at the gender ratio, there are more women than men in our biology undergraduate programs, and yet those women still experience discrimination. So much so, and I'll show you the numbers in a little bit, that they don't continue in their degrees. And by the time you get to the professoriate, you end up with more males than females in most of the STEM fields. So for designated groups in Canada: women, persons with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, and racialized persons. The New Frontiers in Research Foundation, which is administered by SSHRC, also considers LGBTQ+ to be a marginalized group, a designated group. So if we look at what grant applications require, this is the Discovery Grant Merit Indicators from NSERC. And at the bottom here, as part of the training of HQP, we have a big section related to EDI. In order to get exceptional or outstanding, you need to be able to identify the challenges related to EDI that are specific to the institution, your field of research. These need to be clearly described, and you need to indicate specific actions to support the recruitment of diverse HQP and how you are creating an inclusive research training environment. Okay. If we look at NFRF, you need to describe the analysis of the context. So same as the NSERC grant, what is the EDI context of your team, your field, your institution? What is your team composition and recruitment processes? What are the training and development opportunities that you offer to your students? your trainees, and how do you practice inclusion? And so essentially for both of them, what you need to know are what are the EDI issues, what are the hiring practices you employ to recruit diverse trainees, how do you support those trainees, and how do you educate them? I will just mention that CIHR right now does not have a requirement for an EDI statement. My understanding is they are working on that and trying to implement something in the coming years. So what are the issues? What have you done in the past? And what are you planning to do? That is what an EDI statement boils down to. But the first thing that I want to address is why this is important. Why should you care? Why do you have to do this? And if you really nail down the why and have a good understanding of why this is important, it makes it easier to write the EDI statement. There's lots of reasons. Obviously, there's a moral reason. You know, discrimination for reasons of gender or skin color, etc., is for a lot of people morally reprehensible. But there are lots of other reasons. Science affects everyone. And so everyone should have a voice in what science gets done and how it gets done. Science is paid for by the taxpayers for the most part, certainly in Canada. And so it should reflect and serve that demographic. Team science is better when we consider equity, diversity, and inclusion. When we work with diverse teams, our science is better. And there's actually a lot of data to support this. 10 years ago, the scientific field of EDI was really spotty, and the studies were not terribly well done. And then in 2011, I think, I'm going to show you the study in a few minutes. There was a really nice study that really clearly demonstrated what bias and discrimination look like in terms of hiring women in STEM. And this study opened up this field, and since then the number of papers that have been published is well in the hundreds. Like any scientific field, some are good, some aren't so good, but there really is a very strong body of literature. I have an incomplete bibliography reference list if anybody would like to get access to some of those papers. I have a list I'm happy to share if you just want to send me an email afterwards. And then full utilization of human capital. We want people to bring their full selves to the table, because when they bring their full selves to the table, they are happier workers, they are more productive, they're more creative, and that is what we want. I think in Canada, human capital is probably our greatest resource, and it is underutilized right now. And then, of course, diversity drives innovation. There is lots of evidence that this is true in business, in science. And so this is also really important. So there are lots of reasons. Whichever reason, you know, rings true for you the most, that's the one that you want to focus on when you're writing an EDI statement as a reason why this is important, that you should be doing this. So coming back to these topics which frequently show up in EDI statements, what are the EDI issues? What are the hiring practices? Blah, blah, support and educate. So we'll tackle the first one first. I'm going to stop talking in a few minutes. I just want to put things in context, and then we'll have a couple of activities throughout the next hour and a half or so. So what are the issues? We certainly have issues in Canada. If we look at the issues for gender, for women and men, this is from NSERC's WISE report that was released in 2017. There's lots of data in here. I highly recommend having a look at it. It breaks it down by field, etc. What I've shown here is a graph. We are looking at one cohort of individuals who started in grade 1 in 1991 and got their doctoral degree in 2013, some of them. The size of the bar is the number of individuals. This is male on this side and female on this side. And then the percentage is the percentage of the total that are female. So 52% of people graduating with a high school diploma are female. Only 41% of those graduating with bachelor's degree are female. And then what you can see is higher attrition the longer one stays in academia. So only 32% of people graduating with doctoral degrees are female. And what's really fascinating to me is that those numbers haven't actually changed in 20 years. So if we look at the historical statistics, in 1999, the percent of people enrolling in bachelor's degrees was 38, and that was the same as 2014. So the numbers haven't changed. While the perception might be that things are getting better, the numbers don't support that. And I think it's really important, a really important point that we need numbers. As scientists, we need numbers, we need data in order to really understand what the problem is. That is the scientific way, and that's how we should be approaching things. It's not a question of students dropping out in the middle of their degree. What tends to happen is they finish their degree and then they don't proceed into the next level. The only place where we've seen any progress is the doctoral degrees. There was an increase in enrollment in the mid-90s, and then that cohort graduated in the early 2000s. So that's for women. I'd like to tell you what it looks like for racialized students and faculty, but we don't actually collect that data in Canada. And again, that's a problem. If you don't collect that data, you don't know what the problem is or if you're making any progress in addressing that problem. What I can show you is this data from the US. What we're looking at here is the percentage of students who intend to major in the natural sciences, but don't actually graduate with a degree in the natural sciences. So you want this number to be as low as possible. And it is low for white students, but higher for Asian, higher still for Latinx, and then 40%. That's a huge percentage of Black students who want to do a science degree don't actually graduate with that degree. We also know in Canada that racialized faculty are underrepresented. This is data that was published from UBC Press. So 22% of Canadians identify as visible minorities. This is, again, an old term, but only 5 to 17% of faculty at Canadian universities are racialized. And this is not just in STEM, this is in all faculties. 5% is in more rural places like Memorial, and 17% more urban, larger universities like UBC and the University of Toronto. For Indigenous peoples, for the most part in Canada, we don't collect that data nationally. There are some universities that do collect that data and have numbers. I had a quick look through University of Windsor's website and could not find any data that was easily understandable. There might be some internal data. I remember having this conversation last year that that there were efforts to get this data for people. What I can tell you, though, is similar to what we saw for racialized people, Indigenous students do not complete their degrees. If we look at the University of Saskatchewan, which has probably one of the highest undergrad enrollments for Indigenous students, it's a little over 10% of undergrads are Indigenous. Only 75% of those students make it to their second year, compared to 85% of total students. So we know that Indigenous students are dropping out at a rate higher than non-Indigenous students. And then for persons with disabilities, again, we don't know. And when I say disabilities, I encourage you to challenge your idea of what someone with a disability looks like. We automatically think of somebody with a visual impairment or someone in a wheelchair, but disabilities can look a lot of different ways. As an example, I have a disability that you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell when you first look at me. So we don't know much about persons with disabilities, and while anecdotally we know that they are underrepresented, that they experience barriers that make it difficult for them to progress, for us to progress. And so that's something that we need to pay attention to going forward. So why do we have these issues with these gaps? I mean, there are a lot of reasons. But if we look at individuals, I have this theory that an individual's ability to achieve is based on, their inherent abilities, what their parents encourage them to do from a very young age, luck, minus the opportunity gap. And what goes into this opportunity gap is socioeconomic background. We know that people with lower socioeconomic backgrounds have access to fewer opportunities. We also know in Canada and the US that race is strongly tied to socioeconomic background, which is an issue that we don't talk about sufficiently. There's overt discrimination, and this is where somebody believes that they are better than somebody else, consciously thinks that they're better than somebody else for reasons of sex, gender, race, etc. These ones are easier to spot. And then we have unconscious bias, and unconscious bias is behavior that is shaped by implicit, unintended biases that stem from the fact that we exist in society, and society has these biases perpetuated by individuals within society. So people who value their objectivity, like scientists, are paradoxically more likely to fall prey to these biases because they're not paying attention to them. And there are two important things that I want to point out here. One is that regardless of whether or not you intend the bias or not, the outcome, the discrimination, is the same for the person who is experiencing that. By our actions, we are limiting the progress of others. We are hurting other people. Discrimination hurts. And regardless of whether or not we know it, it is still happening. And the other really important thing to note from this slide is that your unconscious bias can be diametrically opposed to your consciously held beliefs. And I'll use myself as an example. I consider myself a strong, successful woman. I think that, women are amazing and should not be discriminated against. And yet I discriminate against women. My gut knee-jerk reaction is that she's not quite as good as she thinks she is. etc. That I don't want to deal with her because she's not the person that I want to work with. I want a man. Those knee-jerk reactions are embedded in us, and unless we pay attention to them, we are victim to them. We are perpetuating this societal the societal discrimination that currently exists, that is limiting what people from marginalized groups can achieve. And for me, that's not okay. So it's really important to note that we are all biased. We all have these biases. Depending on what kind of culture you grew up in, what society you were exposed to, you might have some different biases, but we all have them. And unless we pay attention to them, nothing is ever going to change. But on the flip side, everybody on this call has privilege. We, have the time to participate in this. We're probably reasonably successful compared to many. We have, pretty decently paying jobs, some of us. And we have the ability to influence things in our own spheres. Okay, we have privilege. With privilege comes power. We have the ability to make a difference. It doesn't have to be, changing the world, but there's a lot of evidence that supporting one marginalized person, just one or two statements, one person believing in you when you're a marginalized person changes the entire course of that person's life. There's a lot of evidence for that. So we are privileged, and therefore we have power, and in my opinion, a responsibility to use it, without quoting Stanley too much. Okay, so I've told you the EDI issues in Canada in STEM. If you go to that NSERC report, you can break it down a little bit more. Physics, chemistry, life sciences, etc. A lot of a national organization like the Canadian Association for Physicists is collecting this data for their field. I think most of us looking around at the speakers at our meetings probably have could figure out a relative idea of what it looks like for the field. I will point out here, this is a really important point before we move on, that while you can use statistics, numbers, for departments, institutions, fields, because these are large, you cannot use statistics for your own group, okay? The only way that you could get these numbers is, one, by guessing what your students are, and that's not okay, because you don't always know. And two would be by asking them. And you cannot ask people, it's a violation of their human rights to ask how they identify. You can't do anonymous surveys in groups under 40 people because you cannot maintain anonymity, and people can be discriminated against because of it. So when you talk about your own group, you can't use numbers. You can be vague about, we certainly have some diversity, but you really can't use numbers. Okay, so next, what hiring practices do you employ to recruit diverse trainees? We have come to our first activity. Okay, this is a job ad. Position is available for a highly motivated and skilled postdoctoral fellow to take a leading role in a project on the chemoenzymatic synthesis of carbohydrate derivatives for therapeutic applications. The position will be held within location X at University Y under the supervision of Prof. Z. This is a real job ad from someone I know who gave me permission to use this. The successful applicant must have a PhD in synthetic organic chemistry or a closely related discipline. Correspondingly, excellent theoretical knowledge and practical skills in organic synthesis are required. Candidates with demonstrable expertise in pharmaceutical development will be strongly favored. Expertise with carbohydrates and carbohydrate active enzymes is highly advantageous. The project will comprise a close collaboration within a team comprising organic chemists, biochemists, microbiologists, and preclinical scientists. As such, excellent oral and written communication, excellent oral and written English communication skills, the proven ability to work as part of a team, and strong individual research productivity are essential. They are requiring a cover letter, a CV with a list of publications, and contact information for 3 references. Closing date, university's EDI statement. Okay, so what I like to do is to stop share. I am going to put everyone into breakout rooms. I will first put this link in the chat. This is a link to a version of this so that you can have a look at it on your own computer while you're in the breakout rooms. And what I would like you to do in the breakout rooms is to talk amongst yourselves. What are the issues with this job ad that might prevent a marginalized person from even applying for the ad? Okay. So I am going to I'm going to find the chat, show conversation. Yep. So it's now in the chat. So feel free to click on the link. And then Michelle, if you could put people into breakout rooms, I'll give you about 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes to have a look. Are you there, Michelle?
Yes, I just clicked on it, so everyone should be having something pop up in a second. It's just doing that thinking thing.
Hey guys, what's going on?
Hey, everyone's in breakout rooms for another 6-7 minutes or so.
Oh, okay. The breakout room is quiet, like right before I left it, but I
Oh, do you want to go in a room?
yeah.
Okay. Everyone's looking at a job ad and then seeing how to do it. Oh.
Hi, Dan. It's Tina. Hopefully you can hear me. Right now, everyone is in breakout rooms. So if you want, at the top of your Teams, you should see a thing that says join room. You can join one right now. Everyone's doing an exercise where they're looking at a job ad, and the link to that is in the chat. They're talking about what's wrong with it, and then we're going to join back in the main room and talk about what our findings were.
Hey, Tina, how did you get out of your group? Lisa Willis is in one, but she doesn't know how to get out.
I left the meeting and then rejoined the main meeting link, and then it put me in the main room.
Okay, cool. I'll let her know. Just for those who are here in the main room, we're going to bring everyone back in 2 minutes.
I think we're back in the main room now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Okay, so what did people think about this? Feel free to just unmute yourself and share what it was that your group thought.
Do you want my 2 cents? Jim Green.
Yep.
Okay, so the things that were apparent, and we were not still seeing that while we were discussing it, is the excellent oral and written English skills is clearly going to discourage some people. You know, it almost is indicating that that's from someone from English Canada or the US. And I was looking for, one of my colleagues in the meeting was saying that there it is, that it's kind of blanked out, but all qualified candidates, Canadians and landed immigrants, will be given priority.
Yep.
Obviously going to discourage some people too. My understanding is that statement has to be in there.
That's correct.
And then the third thing that came to mind was that, you know, this happens to be my field, so I know it pretty well, but that there are so many descriptors of the technical expertise of the candidate that it reads to me like they have an individual in mind already, and they're just putting this advert out to cover their behind, is what it reads like.
It looks like it, doesn't it? That's not the case, but it looks like it.
All right, anyway, that's what we came up with.
Awesome, thank you for sharing. Anybody else? Are there any other issues with this?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, I just, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Bilan Munis. We sort of didn't have some discussion, but I thought that part in the content of that italicized part should be put up front, not exactly the italicized part, but sort of describe the work setting first with respect to, you know, what's in the italicized part, that your lab is diverse, et cetera, and by the way, we are looking for somebody to join our group to, you know, continue to work under those kinds of circumstances. Yep. I think that's more important to have that right at the beginning, perhaps not the exact italicized thing, but sort of more personalized version of that.
Exactly. This is also required text from the university. And so the professor may or may not actually care about this. And by having it in the job ad, in their own words, you're exactly right. Yeah, the professor demonstrates that he or she that they actually care. Yeah. Anyone else have an issue?
I think there's a few people with their hands up. I don't know if you can see it in the chat.
Yeah, Rebecca, I have my hand up. Robin is in our group, so she might want to jump in and follow up. But the second paragraph was hugely problematic for us because, like mentioned, they kind of had an idea of who they already wanted based on all of that. But another thing is how many early career people are going to have the advantage of having that list of specializations and potentials for expertise unless they've already been, hand selected and kind of put on that path, right? Because that's a lot of, hey, if you've got this too, and this too, and this too, that would stop so many people from applying.
Yep, absolutely right. Yep.
Yeah, I would just add, like we talked about in our group, that overall the posting is very intimidating. And we talked about the research showing that, women tend to apply for positions that they meet 100% of the criteria, where men are more likely to apply if they meet 60% of the criteria. And so it was intimidating in that way. The adjectives highly motivated and skilled can have some, the skilled could be slightly intimidating. Even the use of the term fellow can be intimidating. I think that was a lot of what we brought up.
Awesome, thank you. Anybody else have anything to add?
Next in order is Jennifer Willett and then Ahab.
Hi. So we had a few thoughts about this. First of all, I should say that I'm from the arts. So our job calls are really different than this. I agree that the equity and diversity language should be throughout the ad. One of the things that I do in the arts is we have images in our ads. So I always have like an image of our lab group, and it is a very diverse group. So it sort of sends a visual message to applicants that we're looking for people from diverse backgrounds. And then the other thing that we talked about that was very similar to what one of the last speakers just said is that this job call sounds like someone who is maybe a mid-career academic, but the role is a postdoctoral fellow. And that type of language can be very intimidating, and a lot of candidates might self-select and say that they are not qualified. And I do find that in my mentorship, women and people from other diverse backgrounds tend to be more likely to be under-boastful about their accomplishments. So I would really tone down the boastfulness of this call and make it more appropriate to someone at the postdoctoral level.
Yep. And then I think there's one more hand up.
Yeah, that would be me. I think, like in our group, none of us were like in the field, but it seemed to us that this was written for a specific individual, and this is how it read, and it pretty much what I got from it and what the discussion was in the breakout room was this is written for like a white Canadian male. And this is and with the specific person in mind, and this is how it reads. And the specificity, the fact that they have to have like excellent oral and spoken English, the lack of subjectivity when it comes to leading a group, and like the English proficiency, and all of these things, and the fact that it starts right away. This is a big giveaway that it's written with a specific individual in mind. Maybe that's not the case, but I've seen ads written for specific individuals, and this has a lot of those properties.
Yep, it does. So this is great. You thank you for volunteering, speaking up. That's wonderful. You caught a lot of what is wrong with this ad. The highly motivated and skilled was problematic. Skilled is one of those hard words that men associate with more than women do. So I changed it to creative. I kept everything else the same. The person who identified the fact that women are less likely to apply to a job ad if they don't meet 100% of the criteria. Absolutely correct. So what I did here, I generalized this instead of synthetic organic chemistry, and experience in at least 2 of the following areas. So less, it doesn't have to be every single one of the following, but experience. And you could even change this to experience or interest, strong interest in at least 2 of the following areas. It still captures the same thing. It doesn't matter what your PhD is in, as long as you've had experience doing this kind of stuff. The project, so this is the big one that I changed. So the project, it still has the same ideas. It's a close collaboration with a diverse team of the same text here, but I pointed out that it's a diverse team. And what I've done is say the ability to communicate effectively orally and written English is essential. So it's not the same as excellent oral and written English. It is communicating effectively, that's all. And so I've toned it down. You could tone this down even more if you wanted to. But this is definitely toned down from the original job ad. And then here is the text. We strongly value diversity in all of its forms and strive to create an inclusive working environment. So that's this in our own words, where everyone feels respected and valued. Candidates will need to demonstrate their ability to work as part of the team. That's something that the person wanted. Their strong individual research productivity. I haven't changed that, although strong is still a strong word. And their commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so I've made it so they can demonstrate this commitment by writing a short statement detailing what they've done, their commitment to EDI. The other thing, so I actually got put into a breakout room, which was really cool because I've never overheard these conversations before. But one of the things that the people in my breakout room came up with was that the contact information for 3 professional references could be problematic. People who are from marginalized groups are less likely to have a strong professional network and less likely to feel confident reaching out to 3 professional references, people who know them well enough to write a reference. And so this could actually be problematic, and I'd never considered that before. So well done. I mean, at a postdoc, do you really need 3 references? Probably at most you need 1 or 2. So yeah, so ways to change the language to make this more appealing to people who are, not English as first language, to women, to lots of other marginalized groups. So thank you for that. So this was the study that I was telling, it was 2012. This was a study that I was telling you about that really opened up the field of EDI research. And this is one that demonstrates bias in STEM hiring. And I don't know if the same biases show up in arts. My suspicion, yeah, I'm not really sure. Arts, depending on where you are in arts, can have a higher percentage of women. But if you look, so even if you look at something like nursing, which is not arts, but nursing, which is dominated, female dominated, if you look at the people who hold power in those spaces, they are more likely to be male than the general demographic suggests they should be. So even in fields that are overwhelmingly female, men are more likely to hold roles of power. So there's some nuance there. But I want to talk briefly about this study because it brings up some important things. The way this study was done was that resumes, CVs, were sent out to faculty at universities in the US, and the faculty were asked to evaluate this CV. It was a student who had just finished their undergrad, wanted to go to grad school in the future, but was applying for a research manager position or a laboratory manager position. And the faculty were asked to evaluate this trainee based on the competence, whether or not the trainee was hireable, and what their starting salary might be, and whether the trainee was worthy of mentoring. And the only difference in those two, in the CVs, they were identical with the exception of the name at the top. The name was either John or Jennifer. And so half were given John, half were given Jennifer, and they were asked to rank them on a scale from 1 to 7. The female student was considered less competent, less hireable, and in fact, her starting salary was about 85 cents on the dollar exactly, which is what we know it to be in general society. And she was less worthy of mentoring. So this was one of the first studies that scientifically demonstrated that identical applicants were not evaluated on the same criteria. Faculty members' bias, this is really important, was independent of their gender. So women were biased against this female candidate the same way that men were. And this gets back to this really important point that this is a societal problem. This is because we're exposed to these biases all the time. We internalize them and we act on them when we don't pay attention to them, to how we're acting. And so women discriminate just as men do. I mean, if you look at politics, 50% of the population of Canada is female, and yet, the vast majority of our politicians are male. We do this. We act on these biases, and the same is true for people from other marginalized groups. I have a disability, and yet I discriminate against people with disabilities, and it kills me. And unless I pay attention to what I'm doing, I fall prey to these. So it's independent of their gender, and this is not the only study. There are lots that show that this is the case. Independent of scientific discipline, I'll show you that on the next slide. Age and tenure status. So it's not as if the younger generation is going to come in and save us and fix things. We have to change how we act. We have to change how we do things in order to make any kind of difference. This is a really cool study that I recommend people looking up just because I thought it was really cool. But I want to move along quickly to this one. This study is essentially the same as the last one, except now they have also included race. So we've got the male-female candidates, but they are white, Chinese, Black, and Latinx. And so what you can see here is that the bias, for the most part, you still see this bias, male-female, with the exception of in here, in biology at the top. This is physics on the bottom. You see that bias in physics a little bit, more so than in biology when it comes to Black and Latinx individuals. But for the most part, we still see that bias. But it's not the same across different racial groups. It's really important to not label all racialized people as the same, and to recognize that different people are going to have different lived experiences. And so recognizing the diversity, not reducing people to one or two of these marginalized groups, is really important in addressing this problem. And yeah, so I'm going to move along. There are lots of really great studies. So this is a fantastic study that's one of the very few that actually looks at interventions that solve some of these problems. And I love it. It's Montana State University. They had a real problem with STEM. 81% of their faculty were male. And so what they did for 1 year, they did this intervention where half of the hires that 1 year just had their normal anti-discrimination, you're not allowed to discriminate training that they always give. And then the other half were the intervention group. And there were 3 interventions. It was very simple. One was a short presentation to the search committee about overcoming the influence of implicit bias. 2 was arming the search committee with a guidebook for tactics for recruiting diverse candidates, kind of like we just went through with that activity. And then 3 was providing access to a faculty family advocate for the candidate when they came to campus to talk about things like work-life integration, childcare, that kind of thing. And this intervention, this is a really simple intervention, but it had a huge impact on the percentage of women who were shortlisted, the percentage who were invited to campus, and the percentage of offers that were made to a female candidate. And what's really cool is also that the percentage of offers accepted by a woman candidate also went up. So the intervention group was over 6 times more likely to offer the job to a woman candidate. And so since then, every hire has had this intervention, and the hiring has been about 50% female ever since. And so this is just one of these examples where really small interventions can actually have a big impact on EDI. So the solutions to bias in STEM hiring, there are considerations when designing the position, when advertising the position, vetting the candidates, and interviewing. And I'm not going to go through these. You can read them yourselves, and any questions at any time, feel free to email me anytime if you have questions about how to do this. Because I want to move on to how do you support your trainees. In order to support your trainees, you have to understand what bias actually looks like in their lives. What is it that they're experiencing? And how would you address these issues? And for more information on this, this is really where there's lots of ideas in this article that might be helpful. I've listed a few here. The general disrespect, being interrupted, for example. A lot of these come from actual studies that were done. So women are more likely to get called by their first name as opposed to their title and last name. And we know that being called by your last name is associated with eminence and fundability, according to the study. Lack of opportunities for people from marginalized groups, lack of acknowledgement for their ideas. And this one is particular to women, a double standard. So a higher penalty when women speak up in groups, when they take risks, and that translates down the road. I mean, we're human. If you touch a stove and it's hot, you don't want to touch the stove again. So if you speak up in groups and you get shut down, or someone talks over you, or your idea doesn't get acknowledged, you're less likely to want to do that. Obviously, you know, I think most of us know about family, the double standard. Men who have children are considered respectable. Women who have children are considered not serious scientists, etc. So you really need to know what it is that your trainees are experiencing in order to be able to support them. And the number one thing that we need to do is to listen, to indicate that we are open to having these conversations, and then to listen when our trainees tell things, to listen without diminishing what the person is experiencing, listen without rationalizing why someone might have done something that has hurt this trainee, listen without trying to solve the problem. Just listen so that the trainee feels heard. And then after that, we can go on to try to address some of the issues that were brought up. But listening is the key to actually supporting trainees. Having a code of conduct and mechanisms for dealing with issues when they arise. I have a code of conduct on my website. I didn't write it, my trainees wrote it when I told them that I thought this was something that would be useful. And so they went away, they wrote it, they came back, and we workshopped it in lab meeting. And it's on the website now. So the code of conduct is a set of shared values, ideals for how we would like our lab to function. And it contains mechanisms for dealing with issues as they arise. I refer to the code of conduct every single time I interview someone, even if it is an undergraduate student. I make sure that they have read the code of conduct and that they are willing to work towards those ideals. It's important to recognize that everybody is at a different place in their EDI journey. I have people in my lab who, when they started, did not know what EDI stood for, didn't know that sexism and racism were things that were challenges in science. and that is fine as long as people are willing to learn. That is fine with me. So lots of ideas here. Having a mechanism for informal information exchange so that people figure out how to figure out what they need to do their job. Telling your team you value them as individuals. Being intentional about lab duties. And we're going to come back to this one actually in a second. So how do you educate your trainees? I have another activity here. So there are 2 male graduate students and 1 female undergraduate summer student in a lab space. This is real. This happened in my lab a couple of weeks ago. The lab is having issues being kept clean. A female postdoc was talking with the summer student and mentions gender roles around cleaning. And the summer student unleashed on that postdoc, essentially said that she has been doing, that summer student has been doing all the cleaning at least 2 days out of 5. When she's at the sink doing her dishes, the graduate students put their dirty dishes in the sink for her to clean. And a graduate student mentioned how he used to live with women and the flat was always clean and organized, but now that he lives with men, the flat is always dirty. So the postdoc relayed this information to me as a PI. What would you do in this situation? So again, we're gonna go into breakout rooms for a few minutes. So Michelle, if you could do that. What is your appropriate course of action? What's going on in this situation?
You should be going into your room shortly.
Awesome, thank you. Yep, you will be automatically moved in 10 seconds.
And Lisa, you're assigned to one as well.
Okay.
Okay.
Michelle, I think these the people in the room with us might not be assigned to breakout rooms because we started them before. So I think you might need to manually move them into one.
Yes, thanks. I'm doing that right now.
Sounds like there was lots of good conversation here. All right, so let's hear it. What were the thoughts? Rebecca Major has hand up. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Hi. As somebody who just had a conversation, we actually didn't get to finish. It was such a good conversation. We were talking about the fact, like, thinking about this from my perspective as an Indigenous person, being heard, but not necessarily needing validation, right? I don't need someone else to validate me, but just being heard is really important. But the idea of creating that safe space and maintaining safety for the student and the situation. So for myself, I would, make sure the student is heard, but make sure, first of all, the student knows that it's a safe space, so you to know this information, which is very key in all of this. So you got to maintain that relationship. And as part of that, what I would do is then provide certain options that may be available on how to move forward, so the student's safety, autonomy, and sovereignty is protected, and that they have options and get to be empowered moving forward on what's happened, so they have that level of control. Because sometimes that is part of the whole intent behind this, was the loss of power, right? And so providing that, but opening it to options of what they may propose moving forward as well for making that decision, because they'll have a different lens than myself, and making sure that that's dealt with what I would call in a good way, so that the student is supported, the research student is supported moving forward in the way that they feel comfortable.
Absolutely. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Do other people have thoughts? How would you have dealt with this situation? Paula has a hand up. Go ahead, Paula.
Hi, thank you for that. In our group, we actually had similar sentiments. We don't want to have any shame on anyone, because so that ended up having an interesting conversation. Was this a gender issue? Was it a cultural issue? Or even was it a case of like postdoc versus grad student versus undergrad? And so our first conversations were kind of about gender, then we went to culture, and then we're like, wait a second, are we creating issues that are actually not there? Could it also be this? So I think we had a lot of good conversations about just trying to understand, so that when we did approach it, we didn't call anybody out, we didn't shame anyone, but that we, just as was mentioned, we gave different options and allowed people to have feedback. And maybe that started off with a general email to everybody here. We're just going to remind you of the rules. And then maybe at our next meeting, we can discuss it further. And then whether people wanted to speak up in the meeting and felt comfortable, or wanted to come back to the PI afterwards, that was an option.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Anybody else have some ideas they'd like to share? Going once, going twice. Alrighty then. Well, I'll tell you what I did. There are a couple of things that are going on here, and I love that you brought this up. It could be gender, it could be cultural, it could be hierarchical. There are lots of things that could be happening here. It could be all of them. And we don't know what the situation is. There's a couple of interesting things here. So the summer student had been here for 3 months and had not said anything, despite the fact that we talk about EDI all the time. And it was only when the female postdoc mentioned gender roles that the summer student felt comfortable, describing what had been happening. And so that creating that space where someone can tell you about their experiences is so key here, so key. If you do not ask, people will not volunteer, especially if you have not made it clear that that you are open to having this kind of conversation. There were a lot of things that the summer student was worried about creating an awkward environment, worried about the students being, the graduate students being upset with her. All of the classic things had been going on, you know, especially with mask wearing, you can't really see people's expressions in the lab. So if she's, you know, focused on her work, they're poking at her, you know, are you okay? Are you okay? Why aren't you smiling? Why aren't you engaging? It's just, it's absolutely typical. So what I did, we were having an EDI meeting anyway. Our lab meeting the following week was about EDI. So every student was to go and find a paper, a scientific paper about EDI, and present it in 1 or 2 slides. And so we had a conversation about EDI. But the students chose things like, you know, there's bias in student teaching evaluations, there's bias in publishing. And so after they were all done, what I said was, do we have an EDI, do we have sexism and racism in our lab, in our environment? Not just in these hypothetical, you know, publishing, you know, USRIs, or they really don't impact the students very much. In our lab, in our environment, do we have sexism and racism and ableism and all of this other stuff? And they froze. So funny, like, you know, predators, prey sensing a predator, like, oh my God, are we in trouble? What's going on? And I said, yes, of course we do, because this is pervasive. This happens everywhere. Of course we do. The key is that we need to address it when it comes up, and we need to learn how to say something. What does it look like in our lab? And I put them into breakout rooms, and I put the 2 male graduate students together in a breakout room with one other male student from one of the other spaces. And I said, you know, what does it look like? What could it look like? What are the possible ways it could manifest in our space? And they couldn't come up with anything. They didn't know. And the other group who had of women who had the same question were like, can we jump in? And I said, no, I need you to just hold on a sec. Because if we don't know what it looks like, then how can we address it? It's really important to understand what it looks like. And so then we started talking about how it could look like, and the women in the lab unloaded a little bit. Cleaning, ordering, working, all of these tasks, how it could show up in our lab. And so we had a really good conversation. And one of the students said, you know, I sometimes comment on people's physical appearance, like their clothing. Is that appropriate? We had a very long conversation about circumstances where it might be appropriate, circumstances where it might not be appropriate. It was a really good conversation. And so we talked about it as a group, reminding ourselves about our code of conduct. And then I spoke with the female summer student about her specific situation. And we had a really good conversation about what the issues were. And then I also talked individually with each of the 2 graduate students in that space. And they both agreed that anyone who was experiencing the kind of thing she was experiencing, that was not something that they wanted and didn't realize that it was happening. And part of it was just a complete communication issue, a lack of understanding. So when she's at the sink doing dishes, they put their dirty dishes in the sink. Her perception was that they wanted her to clean the dishes. Whether or not they were doing that, we never talked about that, but we talked about, you know, how that might come across. And both of the male students wanted to talk to her, and I made sure that she was comfortable and confident in saying what she needed her boundaries to be and how we could change the systems in place in the lab to make sure that these things don't happen. So now we have a cleaning schedule that everybody agreed on. with weekly tasks to make sure that this doesn't happen. We put protocols in place so that if someone's at the sink doing their dishes, nobody else puts their dishes in the sink until that person is done. So we put protocols in place to make sure that this doesn't happen. And again, I debriefed with all of them afterwards to make sure that people are confident and happy and feel comfortable in what happened, that it was a learning experience. Nobody felt, as far as I'm aware, that they were singled out or felt bad about it. They felt bad because they value her and they liked her and they didn't want her to feel bad, and didn't realize that what they were doing had consequences. And so that is how that shook out. But it's an important thing to think about. Having these conversations, when you have these conversations, stuff is going to bubble up. And being open to having these conversations is really important. She is super happy now, so happy. She was able to set her boundaries. She felt enabled to do so, and she's staying to work with me for another 8 months, and she's amazing. I adore her, so I'm so happy. So education is really important. Attending EDI seminars and workshops as a group and then talking about things afterwards. Having journal club where we talk about EDI papers. It doesn't have to be STEM if you're not in the STEM field. Discussing professionalism. A lot of this behavior is just unprofessional. And, when you're in grad school, there's a really, really strong overlap between your personal and professional lives. And a lot of students have never worked in a professional environment. They don't know what that looks like. So, gossiping about other students, for example, is unprofessional, and always seems to happen in a way that further marginalizes those who are already marginalized. So discussing professionalism can be key, especially if you're new to the EDI area. Just starting with professionalism is really important. Calling out and calling in inappropriate behavior. This was one of the things that I actually said in the group meeting. I said, all right, so how do you call out inappropriate behavior? And they were like, oh, you just tell someone that they've done something wrong. And I was like, okay, I have just said something inappropriate to this student. How do you address that if you're the person who was watching it? And they all stopped. And even though we've had this conversation and they know that they can tell me if I've done something stupid because I've told them they can, it was uncomfortable for them because there is a power dynamic there. And I just reminded them that again and again and again and again, that if I say something that is offensive, I have not done it to be offensive, because I genuinely value all of you. I've done it because, and I've not realized that I've done it. So I need you to tell me that I have done it so that I can address that. I am open to hearing about how I've said something that could be improved. And this is probably the most important thing, is leading by example, by putting yourself out there to be criticized. You cannot expect, your trainees to talk about these kinds of things if you don't talk about it. You can't expect them to learn how to call someone out if you don't call someone out. And it doesn't have to be in a confrontational way. I've had conversations where someone has said something that's offensive, and I said, okay, I want to push back a little bit on that statement, and this is why. It's not about calling that person an idiot or telling them they've done something wrong or telling them they've been offensive, but just, I need to push back on that, and here are the reasons why. On my website, I have a link to this fabulous document called Interrupting Bias. And it talks about the difference between calling someone out and calling someone in, and different words that you can use to start that conversation. It's really useful. So that's essentially wraps it up for the most part. What are the issues? what have you done, and what are you planning on doing? So these are active things. These are things that you actually need to do in your lab, policies that you need to put in place, practices that you need to engage in order to write an EDI statement. So do's and don'ts, make sure you read the instructions because every EDI statement is different. Discuss the impact. So what is the issue? How are you addressing it? And how do you expect that to help solve that particular problem? And this is all personal. It's all about what you do. There is no one gold standard EDI statement. I get asked this all the time. People are worried that there's going to be standardized text that doesn't mean anything. But this is part of the HQP training plan, and there's no standardized text for an HQP training plan. People write about what it is that they do, and it's obvious when someone is speaking authentically about things that they do. How much they care comes across. It really does. And as reviewers become more and more educated, they see more and more of these statements, they become more and more savvy as to what looks like a good, authentic EDI statement. Do not assume women and racialized individuals are the only diversity groups. Do not conflate sex and gender. This is more for actually writing it into your research proposal as part of your program or your project. Do not put statistics for your group. You cannot collect that data anonymously. Do not say you will follow the university's policies. If those policies worked, we wouldn't be having these conversations. Do not say everything is already fine in your group. It does not matter if your group is 100% racialized, disabled women who are LGBTQ. It doesn't matter. Everybody still needs education. Everybody still needs that repeated conversation about those shared goals. What are we working towards? How do we want to interact with one another? Do not say that everything is fine. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this. And do not focus on the research. This is not about research. This is about people, okay? People who are working in your space. That is what EDI statements are about. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much for your participation. And we'll stop recording now, and I'm happy to answer any questions.